Well, I'm going to draw from my childhood a little bit today. And part of that is because as I'm raising my own kids, I think about my own upbringing and things from my past. So some lessons hit me a little bit closer to home because they're problems that I have myself. And today is one of those lessons where I have thought a lot recently about a fault of my own that I'm really trying to stem. I'm really trying to work on it. And it was highlighted recently by May. You know, May is 3 years old now. She repeats everything. And May overheard me grumbling about something. And it was just something, just a frustration, whatever it was. Maybe it was something in traffic. I don't remember exactly what it was, but I just kind of grumbled and I said something like, come on. And I heard her in the back seat say, come on. And, when your kids copy everything you say and you realize that doesn't sound really good coming out of a 3-year-old's mouth. And it probably doesn't sound any better coming out of someone who's 40 either. And I want to reassure you, just in case anybody's concerned, Ryan Goodwin does not use curse words or anything like that. So it's not like I'm hearing my kids say bad words in the house. Like, well, where'd you learn that from? From our father. Like, they're not like anything like that, but I guess it was just highlighted by when you hear the innocent lips of a 3-year-old saying things like, oh, come on, or oh, stop it, or just kind of grumbling and growling and expressing that kind of frustration. You realize they learn it from somewhere, and mostly they're learning it from you as a parent. So I want to talk about grumbling, and this, of course, is our second Sunday, and so we have about 15 minutes. We're not going to get super deep into this subject, but just maybe if I can share a little bit with you some of my own problem with grumbling and what the Bible has to say about it, then maybe you also can take some of the first steps that are required to nip this in the bud in your own life. And yes, Mr. Grumble is our title for our lesson. Roger Hargreaves started making the Mr. Men books all the way back in 1978. So I imagine I'm not the only person in this room who remembers Mr. Men books from childhood. And of course, Mr. Grumble was one of them. Mr. Grumble complained about everything. He woke up in the morning and complained about the sunshine coming up. He complained about the noise. He complained about birds. He complained about people. And eventually he met a wizard who turned him into a pig. I know, it's an odd story. But then Mr. Wizard turned him back from being a pig and he learned his lesson about grumbling about everything. So hopefully it doesn't take God turning us into a pig or like Nebuchadnezzar being turned into thinking you're a cow for us to realize the problem we have with grumbling. Now, I'll start by saying this. At face value, the Bible is really blunt about grumbling. If you're looking for something crystal clear that you can hold on to, what does the Bible have to say about grumbling? The Bible could not be any clearer about the problem with grumbling. James 5, verse 9, do not grumble against one another, brothers, that you may not be judged. So, that's a command. Let's be clear about this. That's a command. You are commanded in the Bible in James 5:9, do not grumble against one another. Philippians 2 verse 14, do all things without grumbling or complaining. Do all things. And when Paul talks about all things, especially in the book of Philippians, be anxious for nothing, pray about everything, like in Philippians chapter 4. When Paul talks about all things, does he mean all things? Drive without grumbling and complaining. Buy groceries without grumbling and complaining. Raise your kids without grumbling and complaining. Take them to soccer practice without grumbling and complaining. Interact with your spouse without grumbling and complaining. Interact with other church members. Interact with your elders. Interact with fill in the blank. Do all things without grumbling and complaining. Do not grumble among yourselves. And in John 6, verse 43, that's Jesus saying that. Now, I understand that there's a context there, and he's talking about this idea of, I am the living bread. You have to eat my flesh and drink my blood. And as a result of this, the Jews were grumbling about that. But there's Jesus plainly and bluntly saying in John 6, do not grumble. So it would seem that the Bible is crystal clear. We are commanded by God not to be grumblers. And maybe some of that is colored by the experiences of the Israelites in the book of Exodus. You know, back in Exodus, when the Israelites were taken out of Egyptian slavery and they crossed the Red Sea, well, even before they crossed the Red Sea, when they saw the Egyptian army, coming after them, they saw the dust of Pharaoh's chariots on the horizon. And instead of having faith in God, they looked at Moses and said, great, now we're all going to die. Well, then they crossed the Red Sea and went into the Promised Land, and Moses is taking a long time at Mount Sinai. Where in the world did he go? Aaron, make for us a god. We got to have something to do right now. So they made the golden calf. And then it didn't take long. We're thirsty. We're hungry. Are we there yet? And it was like 40 years of the Israelites sitting in the back seat complaining at Moses, and Moses is there up on the driver's side going, will you stop asking? We'll get there when we get there. And so the example of the Israelites murmuring and complaining is brought up over and over and over again. I just provided a few examples from Exodus and Numbers themselves, but also Psalm 78, like really the whole psalm of Psalm 78 is about the history of Israel and their faithlessness toward God. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 11 also. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul brings out the example of the Israelites in the wilderness. And at one point he even said, and that we need to learn to not grumble as they grumbled. And God's judgment was brought upon them. All right, so again, at face value, grumbling, it seems, is very clearly proscribed in the Scriptures. And you can't deny that. I mean, I don't know how many more verses we can show you. Do not grumble, do not grumble, do not grumble. It's crystal clear. But I guess the next question that someone might have is like, well, what exactly is included in this? I mean, are we really talking about every single example of frustration that I've expressed? Every time I mutter under my breath, every time I just express like a displeasure with something, am I not even allowed to fill out like a comment card at a restaurant and tell them that I got bad service? Is that included in grumbling also? All right, let's talk about that then. What is meant by grumbling? Now, I personally am hesitant to go as far as saying that all expressions of frustration are condemned in the Bible because Jesus himself expressed frustration a time or two. And I put a couple of examples, but there are others as well. There are times where the text comes right out and says, and so Jesus groaned deeply. And what does it sound like when you groan deeply? And so Jesus himself expressed frustration at times. And Paul expressed frustration at times as well. The whole book of Galatians is colored by frustration. You foolish Galatians. You foolish Galatians. I thought you had been born again, but now I have to go back and you need to be born again. You foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? I wish that I didn't have to take this tone with you, you foolish Galatians. And so Galatians is an expression of Paul's frustration. And so Paul and Jesus and others in the Bible also, they don't hide it when situations test their patience. Certainly it's not grumbling when you offer somebody a rebuke. 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 2, which is our theme passage for the year, does talk about when you preach the word, part of preaching the word is correcting people and rebuking people. And so is it grumbling when I, with all the love in my heart, come up to you and say, brother, sister, I don't think that you're living up to God's standard right now? Is that grumbling, to point out when people are in sin and they're not living by God's will or by God's standard? I don't think that that's grumbling. Or to groan deeply about sin and injustice. Is it grumbling to look at a world that's rife with sin and to express frustration over that? Well, again, I don't think that that's included in this condemnation of grumbling. Is it grumbling to express dismay over the trials that you're going through in life? Well, Job is an interesting example of that, and I don't think Job was sinning. In fact, Job, the text even points out that in all the things that he had said, at least up to a certain point, that he was not sinning, and yet he was very blunt about, like, okay, I've lost everything. My family is dead. My possessions are gone. My body hurts, and my wife just told me to go curse God and die. Why don't you? So, yeah, things are not going very well for me right now. And there were a lot of times in Job where he plainly and very bluntly expresses dismay over the trials that he's going through. The martyrs in Revelation chapter 6, verses 9 through 11. There are these martyrs that are seen in this image below the altar of God, and they're crying out with a loud voice. New American Standard says they are crying out with a loud voice saying, "How long, O Lord?" I mean, that's frustration, isn't it? That's frustration. Was Paul grumbling when he enumerated his misfortunes in 2 Corinthians 11? And I've been beaten this many times, and I've been whipped this many times, and I've been cast out into the sea and thrown into prison cells. Is that grumbling? And so I think it's a challenge for us. Here's the challenge. You know, we look at examples of frustration in the Bible, and maybe it's easy for us to justify our own, what is actual grumbling, by saying, well, I'm just being like Jesus, right? Even Jesus got frustrated sometimes. Listen, if Jesus had to drive on freeways in Memphis, he would act exactly the way I do. He'd want to run someone off the road too. And I think maybe we look at these examples of frustration, which really, is it grumbling and complaining, or is it the expression of a righteous indignation? And maybe there's a very subtle difference between those things, but it's a difference. Job was not complaining in the same way that the Israelites were complaining in the wilderness. Jesus and Paul were not complaining and murmuring the way the Israelites were murmuring in the wilderness. Right? These examples of frustration are not the same thing as the Israelites in the wilderness going, "Oh, give us water. I'm thirsty. I'm sick and tired of this manna, God. I could use some meat. We ain't had nothing but moldy bread for 3 stinking days, and we want some meat." That's the Lord of the Rings reference. If you get it, you get it. That's fine. But none of this stuff on the board is the same thing as the Israelites murmuring and complaining in the wilderness. So, with our last few minutes, we're going to bring it to a close to find out if I am being Mr. Grumble. And I want to offer you a few tests, right? You take a look at your life and ask yourself some questions about your language, your attitude, and if you can look at these things, run these tests on your life, and you might discover that you are, in fact, being Mr. Grumble. All right, first of all, grumblers don't typically offer any solutions. They just like to highlight the problems. And so if all you're doing is highlighting the problem, if all you're doing is saying, "Oh, I hated this and I hated that, and he did this wrong and he did that wrong," and you're not kind of balancing that by saying, "Yes, you did this wrong, but here's something you could have done a different way. Here's how you could have done it better. Here's how I would have done it." Right? If you're not offering any solutions to a problem, then you're probably being Mr. Grumble. You're probably just being Mr. Grumble. You're being like Cain in Genesis 4. When Cain received his just punishment from God for murdering his brother, all Cain could do was go, "Well, that's not fair. That's not fair. He says, "This punishment is too hard." It's too hard for me to bear. Dude, you murdered your brother. Like, quit. You murdered your brother. Quit whining. Quit complaining. Grumblers forget their blessings, their resources, their opportunities, while only fixating on the things that are uncomfortable or inconvenient. And going back to that 1 Corinthians 10 passage, Paul starts off the chapter by saying, remember the Israelites, remember them in the wilderness. Did they not all receive these incredible blessings? Were they not all baptized by Moses in the Red Sea? Did they not all have access to spiritual food and spiritual drink? Like, did those Israelites not have incredible and immense blessings? But all they could focus on was, I'm tired. I'm uncomfortable. I don't like the taste of manna. Moses isn't doing it right. And so they fixated only on the complaints, and they forgot that they had this incredible treasure trove of blessings. In the long run, grumbling brings about diminishing results, or things that might even be worse than just diminishing results. There's a great passage in Numbers chapter 14 that I really want to read it because I love the way that the language describes it here. Like, here's the result of grumbling. You want to grumble and complain about something? Well, watch out, because grumbling and complaining will probably make matters worse for you. It says in Numbers chapter 14 and in verse 27, and this is God speaking to Moses, how long shall I bear with this congregation who are grumbling against me? I have heard the complaints of the sons of Israel which they're making against me. Say to them, as I live, says the Lord, just as you've spoken in my hearing, so I will surely do to you. Your corpses will fall in the wilderness, all your numbered men, according to your complete number from 20 years old and upward, who have grumbled against me. Surely you shall not enter into the land. Oh, how'd that work out for you? Listen to what God is saying. How long do I need to put up with this people? All they do is grumble against me, and I have heard their complaining. Okay, so you did receive the comment card then. Good. What are you going to do about that, God? You're all going to die in the wilderness. Whoops. Got a lot more than you bargained for there, didn't you? They complained. God said, how long do you really think I'm going to be patient with you with all this whining and complaining? And the result was, because of your complaint, oh, I heard your complaining. I heard it. Message received, loud and clear. So every single one of you, 20 years old and up, is going to die in the wilderness, and you will not enter the land. Why? Because you complained. So watch out. They'll spit in your food. They will. Complain enough at a restaurant, they'll spit in your food. And I think it's just kind of the idea of when you just live by grumbling, the grumbling never actually produces anything useful in your life. The grumbling always produces these diminished results, or, as the case is with the Israelites, something that may be even worse. Grumblers want to apply a standard to others that they would never accept for themselves. Oh, you could do it better? You really think you could do it better? If you just call the grumbler out, usually the grumbler is just talking. And they don't actually want to try to do it better. They just like that you're doing it and you're doing a bad job, and they get to complain. And grumbling is often a defense mechanism or a cover-up for our own insecurities or our own inability to understand something deeper. And that was the case in John chapter 6. Here Jesus is trying to talk to them about what he's offering. He's saying, Moses gave you manna in the wilderness, and your forefathers all died. It was just manna. That's all Moses gave you was manna in the wilderness. I am offering you the living bread that comes down out of heaven. And if you eat of this bread, you will live forever. And you know what they were doing? The text says that in John chapter 6, the text says, and as a result of this, they went around and they just started grumbling. Ain't Simon giving us flesh to eat? What is this living bread coming out of heaven? I don't get this guy is a nut job. You know why they were grumbling and complaining? Because they didn't get it. They were being dense. And they didn't get it. And I think sometimes we use grumbling and complaining also as a defense mechanism for when we just don't get something. It's easier to complain about it than to try and wrap your mind around it. Now, this was mostly for me. I caught myself grumbling a little bit too much as a parent. And maybe it's more of a personality flaw than I thought it was. And I needed to nip this in the bud. Maybe something I've said today will help you do the same thing, or to recognize in your own life the way that grumbling and complaining has kind of seeped in on the periphery. Because when it starts on the periphery and you just leave it alone, eventually it cuts all the way to the heart. And God really is concerned about our hearts. And if you can get your heart right, then your words will follow, your actions will follow. So let's have a prayer together as we bring this part of our worship to a close. And let's remember these things, and hopefully we can use them as we move forward in life. Let's pray together. And remember, after this prayer, we're going to be dismissed to our group meetings. If you're a visitor here with us today, you're more than welcome to sit in on one of our group meetings and just kind of observe the business of our congregation. Or if you'd like to stay here in the auditorium, our kids are going to have a little Bible drill, and you're certainly welcome to sit in on that. Either way, we're glad that you're here today, and we're glad that you're participating with us in our worship. But let's pray at this time. Our God in heaven, we thank you so very much for this beautiful sunny day. We thank you for